in terms of the timing of this announcement, a lot of the criticism of the Regulatory Standards Bill has been, I suppose, about trying to sneak in a kind of covert agenda in terms of deregulating aspects of our regulatory lives. Would it be fair to say that you're using this announcement to show that there is a common sense reason for deregulating some parts of life that is not necessarily about trying to remake the constitution of this country?
Well, first of all, I think that this example does show why we need to get better at regulating in this country. But actually, just about any week that I talk about the Regulatory Standards Bill, I can point you to, if it's not AML, it's CCCFA. If it's not that, it's Building Act and Building Standards. If it's not that, it's Resource Management Law. If it's not that, it's the regulation of early childhood education. Every week, in every way, New Zealanders are spending too much time on regulatory activity instead of productive activity. And the core of the Regulatory Standards Bill and the entire regulation portfolio is to free people up from pointless compliance activity so that we can get on with providing for ourselves and our families and our communities.
Just on the Regulatory Standards Bill, did you catch any of Geoffrey Palmer's submission? If so, what did you think of it?
Well, I mean, look, he's got every right to his opinions. But frankly, if he thinks that it's too hard for the government to keep tabs on all the rules it's making, he should be worried about all the poor buggers out there that have to follow the government's rules. And this is one of the points I've frequently made. If it's too much of a faff to make laws carefully and properly here in Wellington, imagine how much a faff it is for the people out there who take longer to get permission to do something than actually do it. That's the real problem.
There were quite a few people that submitted today that were against the bill. Did it give you pause for thought at all around progressing it?
Well, I'll have a look at what they're saying specifically, but I have to say there's been so much misinformation about the bill that you have to really search for a needle in a haystack to find the really constructive criticism about it. This is a piece of legislation that will make it much, much harder for politicians to just lazily put red tape on New Zealanders. It will make it much, much easier for New Zealanders to challenge bad laws. And if we're going to truly unleash the potential of New Zealanders, that's absolutely essential. I also saw a comment, I'm sorry, I will come to you, Julia, there, a comment that there is something strange about this bill. Well, actually, this bill brings together a lot of things that are already required. We already have principles of good regulation in the legislative advisory guidelines. Just not many people know about them. We already have regulatory impact statements, but other than Thomas Coghlan, not many people know about them. Actually, what we're doing is taking things that the government already does in different ways, and we're putting them together in one black letter law that governments must follow so New Zealanders have some rights. There's nothing really new here, so it's odds to call it strange when it's actually things that government's been doing for a long time.
One argument against it, though, is that for simply that reason, it's already been done. What's the point in replicating it?
Well, I question whether it's been done effectively. I think the fact that so few people are aware of the legislative advisory guidelines, the fact that regulatory impact statements are held in such low esteem is actually the case for putting this in a proper parliamentary law, saying that these are the standards of making rules in New Zealand, and if you don't like the way the government's doing it, here's an independent body you can go to, the Regulatory Standards Board, and challenge them. So it's in some ways not new, and that's true, and I understand that criticism, but I also don't believe anyone seriously thinks that what we're doing right now is working, and that's why we're drowning in red tape in this country.
One of the main arguments for today is that the legislation doesn't mention the treaty, and that some of the submitters would like to see the treaty mentioned as one of the principles. Yeah. What's the thinking behind not having it included? What I really genuinely wish you could do for me right now is give an example of where having the principles of the treaty and the Regulatory Standards Bill would change the outcome. Because if you look through the principles we have, they're all designed around making sure that every New Zealander has a government that makes laws carefully and is accountable to them. Now, if you can explain why putting a principle of the treaty in would enhance that, then I'd be really interested to hear it. But all these people sort of mindlessly say, you must have the Treaty of Waitangi because it's our founding document. All of that is true,
but they're not really able to give a practical example of why making the treaty a principle in this particular law would change the amount of red tape New Zealanders face, which is its purpose.
Just to be clear, you do think that legislation should be measured against our founding document?
Well, I don't understand how that is going to change the outcome. And again, my challenge is, if you can give me an example of what it would mean.
That you just said that was fair. It was a fair point to make, to expect that legislation would be. That's not what you just said?
No, I think you're mixing up two things I've said. It is true that it's our founding document, but it's not true that legislation must be measured against it.
So that's your position? You don't think the Treaty of Waitangi needs to be taken into consideration when it comes to legislation?
No, I'm open-minded. I'll consider it if people can give me...
So why did you put it into this legislation here, into this bill?
I'm open-minded, and I'll consider it if people will give me a practical example of how considering the principles of the treaty would change the law.
Because you designed this piece of legislation, you determine whether the treaty should have a place in it. Why have you decided it doesn't?
Because I'm still waiting. I mean, you could give me an example right now, right? But you're not going to.
I think that the basic point is that it's our founding document.
Okay, but how does that change the practical outcome of the laws that people in New Zealand end up
And
following?
if it doesn't change it as you suggest, what's the problem in putting it in there?
Well, first of all, I don't want people to invent a reason to further down the track. Second of all, why would you put something in for no reason? I mean, this is the kind of mindlessness.
The founding document of this country.
But the point of the law is to improve the rules that New Zealanders have to live under. This is actually a practical project. It's not a sort of spiritual exercise.
So
it's
it
actually
draws back to your idea that the treaty is in itself red tape.
no, I haven't said that at all.
Is that what you're suggesting?
No, I haven't said that at all. No, I haven't suggested that at all. That's what you'd like to report, I can tell.
I'm just
But
trying to interpret your comments.
well,
and
here's
trying to
the
figure out where
if
you're
you can find any person that will give me a practical example of how putting the treaty into the regulatory standards bill would change the outcome in a way that's better for all New Zealanders, then I'm open-minded.
So that's-
I have been the whole time. But so far, not a single person who's mindlessly said, oh, but it's our founding document, it should be there, can practically explain how that makes the boat go faster.
Do you
So I
think
said
You're
you're
open to somebody, if somebody's able to convince you as a reason to why the Treaty of Waitangi needs to be in the regulatory standards bill, you're open to amending the legislation to insert that as a clause?
Yeah, look, I listen and I change my mind all the time. But so far, I've had a whole lot of people who have, and you've just seen an example of it, and I think people will be really interested to review that exchange. People, well, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, we've had this whole kōrero now, Mikey, and I'm still waiting for you to say, well, here's one of the practical examples I'm thinking of, and what have you thought of that? But all I'm hearing is, you know, putting words in my mouth which aren't true, trying to get me to say things I haven't said, and I just think we need a higher level of debate.
I know this comes back to the disagreement over treaty principles, but I suppose some of the critics might say that adding the consideration of partnership with Māori would be worthwhile when considering lawmaking.
Well, again, it's not really clear how that would actually help make a better law. I mean, the question is, what are the impacts on people's liberties? What are the impacts on people's property? Do people have access to the law? Is it written down? Is it clear? Do the courts have the right to adjudicate it? If there's fees or taxes or levies under a law, then are those set fairly in proportion to the costs that people pay? Now, all of those things apply to Māori people and they apply to non-Māori people. If you're suggesting that a Māori person will have a different approach to paying a tax or a levy, well, you know, that's interesting, but I don't really see how that applies. And again, the challenge, I think, is for these people to explain exactly why they think that the principles, the basic principles of lawmaking that are already in the legislative advisory guidelines, or very similar to, why would they apply differently to one group of people from
Do you
another?
think the regulatory standards...
Have you listened to any of the submissions today? There was quite an interesting one from Dunedin Council where they talked about how in the Local Government Act there's, you know, reference to the treaty, and so when they create their council bylaws, they're considering the impact on the whole community. There was another submission from Healthcare Coalition that talked about property rights and what happened in Australia with, you know, cigarette plain packaging. Philip Morris argued that their property rights had been violated. So that resulted in a very late fee, very
Yeah,
costly.
well, there's two interesting examples, and I haven't seen those specific submissions. I haven't been able to watch them all day, but when it comes to consulting the whole community, I mean, one of the things the bill says is that all people who are directly and materially affected should be consulted. So I completely agree with that. But I think what we're saying is consistent with what you've described Dunedin Council saying. Now again, when it comes to the question of plain packaging, you could argue that it's a violation of property rights. The answer might be either that you have to pay compensation, or you could say, we don't want to pay compensation, we do want to take away their rights, and we're just going to do it because we think fighting smoking is so important. That's up to the public to judge, because remember, this regulatory standards bill does not prevent a government or a parliament from making a law or a regulation. What it does do is create transparency so that the people can actually watch and understand what their representatives are doing.
Doesn't it hamstring the ability of health advocates and legislators to put health as a priority? If they are fearful that they could have to pay compensation, or that they could.
So just to be clear, are you suggesting that somebody who lobbied a government would have to pay compensation under this bill?
I'm saying that the Aotearoa Health
Because
Coalition
that
also made the point of the case of.
Well, that wouldn't happen. I mean, that's a
they,
nonsense.
well, they just said that the fear is that corporations could take the government to court over situations like that.
Right.
Are you concerned that could be the case?
Well, no, because the legislation is very, very clear. It says nobody gains any actionable legal rights from this piece of legislation. So you would be laughed out of court immediately if you tried to take such an action, because I'm deliberately putting it there in black and white.
And you've
So
got legal experts who have also raised similar concerns. And they've read the black and white fine print as well, and yet they still have concerns around that particular point, around the potential for compensation claims to be taken against the government.
well, this is one of the areas, if you follow the debate and you read, that's been totally debunked. You know, there's people have said, the people claiming that this will force a government to pay compensation, being sued by anybody. That they've said that that's not true. These are people who, by the way, oppose the bill, but they say, you know, that's basically peddling conspiracy theories, and you ought to stop.
It's not me, sorry, with all due respect, Deputy Prime Minister, acting. It's not me, it's the people who have made submissions today, legal experts,
and they've been debunked. I mean, you know, it's there in black and white. People have said, look, I oppose this bill, but on that basis it's wrong. So again, I think you need to look more closely.
Is there a failure here from potentially your perspective or your office to have not have done a better job proactively getting ahead of these concerns and selling the bill in a different way? Or is it the sense that you feel there's a lot of bad actors out there that are spreading knowledge?
Well,
or is it a mix of the two?
You know, I go back to something like, you might remember the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There were people out there that no matter what you said, they would say, oh, no, they're lying, it's not true, I found an expert somewhere that supports my view, so therefore I'm right. We've faced this before. We had it, dare I say it, around vaccination during the COVID period. We had it over the rollout of 5G. There will always be a group of people out there, and some of them will say they're lawyers, and some of them will say they're experts, and some of them will say they're in politics once, and they will say, well, actually, you know, we think that this is terrible. Now, I think the truth is that every government has failed at convincing 100% of people. There will always be a group of people that get animated, and usually they'll have some issue or other. You know, the time I've been in politics, as I say, it's been the TPP, it's been 5G, it's been the vaccine. At the moment, it's the regulatory standards bill. One day it'll be something else, and you'll be asking someone else the same question.
There have been versions of this type of law in the past that has made its way to the House and failed. How is this version different, and why do you think it'll be successful this time around?
Well, first of all, it is quite different in that it does not give direct recourse to the courts. We've changed that because people are concerned about judicial activism. That's not a criticism of the judiciary, by the way, but it is a bill that's been significantly changed from previous versions. But also, sometimes it's just an idea whose time has come. As I've said, on other issues. The End of Life Choice Act, 1995, 2003, finally passed in 2019. Homosexual law reform started in 1974, had another couple of goes in the 70s, finally passed in 1986. Sometimes it just takes a while for an idea like this to percolate.
Do you have the only say when it comes to the appointment of the board?
Well, I don't. It's appointed by the Appointments and Honours Committee, which is a subcommittee of Cabinet.
Oh, okay. Reading the bill, it says that it's appointed by the minister.
Well, legally that's what it says, but in practice, there's lots of areas like that, but it's appointed by the Cabinet.
Just on Jason's question.
Sorry, I know, yes.
Sorry. Do you think that voters, since the bill isn't legally binding, they can't take it to court to challenge a regulation? It's just sort of a name and shame, bad laws. We already have that with the Bill of Rights, and periodically the government will breach the Bill of Rights in some way. The minister will stand in Parliament and explain why, and the public won't pay any attention. It doesn't seem to really put any pressure on ministers to not do so. Do you really think this bill will have much effect on future government that doesn't include the Anti Party?
Well, it's kind of interesting because Sir Geoffrey Palmer was responsible for putting the Bill of Rights into law, and I think most people would argue that it has been very effective in changing behaviour. You're right, the Bill of Rights, until very recently, hasn't had any impact in courts of law. However, it has, I think, really changed behaviour. It has put a bit of a chill on politicians who say, well, if we do that, we'll get a hostile Section 7 report, as we call it. Not sure, sometimes they do, and that's kind of the point. This law won't stop politicians ultimately from doing things. But it will start to say, well, this is what good lawmaking looks like. We as a community place a value on that, and we ought to have more of it.
I guess the concern...
Sorry.
Oh, no, the example of the tobacco, plain packaging tobacco labelling is an interesting one, because obviously there is nothing, after this bill passes, there will be nothing that would stop a future government, if we didn't already have it, from doing that. And I haven't seen any polling, but I imagine it's broadly supported, it's pretty popular overseas. It would, however, I suppose, add another check and make it more difficult for a government to do that, because it would name and shame, I guess, the institution would name and shame, the mechanisms that the bill sets up would name and shame a measure like that. Can you see why, given what appears to be the broad popularity of plain packaging tobacco and the anti-smoking sort of movement, can you see why people are a little bit concerned that this bill would make it more difficult to achieve a broadly popular public policy aim?
Well, it will make it more difficult to make laws that take away people's property rights, there's no question. But you could make a similar argument around the game patch law. It was noted as a violation of the Bill of Rights. The government decided that due to the scourge of gangs and intimidation, it was worth doing. I think what it does is it creates a threshold where governments will ignore the controls around bad lawmaking if they think there's sufficient political support. But there'll be a whole lot of other laws that they might have made without it that they decide not to, and that's how we get better regulations overall.
In terms of that specific exclusion from the bill creating a mechanism by which a company could sue the government over a regulatory change, that exclusion you've included there, is it the position of you and the ACT Party that you prefer that not to be there, and that the government has compromised on that part of the bill?
Sorry, just say that once more.
So the part of the bill that that does not allow private entities to sue the government for damages regarding a regulatory change.
That's always been the case with every version of the regulatory standards bill going back some time.
Okay.
It's never been intended as a constitution of that sort. It has allowed people to take action against the government for not doing good business effectively.
Right. So it's not the position of you or the ACT Party that you would prefer a stronger bill that would not have that part in it, because that has been in the bill.
Look, I think once you go down that pathway, you can invite some real difficulties. I mean, it would take us to a much more American place, and that's not really where we're trying to go with this. This preserves the sovereignty of Parliament to make laws. It just gives the public a lot more visibility about what politicians.
And in terms of the way that the treaty is touched by or not touched by the bill, do you think that the impact of the regulatory standards bill on the way that the treaty is applied across the gamut of government, do you think it will have no change on the way that the treaty is applied across government, or a change you know, I'm not sure positively or negatively, but do you think it will change the application of the treaty in some way?
I think it'll have very little effect. I mean, it will uphold people's property rights more than anything. And frankly, I actually think it would have been helpful if the Regulatory Standards Bill was in place in sort of the 1840s, 50s and 60s. If governments had been a bit more respectful of property rights back then, we'd have far fewer problems in New Zealand today.
On the just one final one, sorry, that one of the regulatory red lines I think in the last 10 years is the Te Wai stuff, and I suppose you could trace the genealogy of that to iwi that are frustrated with the way that their water has been treated in the past. And that has led to problems in a treaty sense, because you'd probably say that Article 2 is pretty clear around stuff like water. Mana Te Wai was pretty clearly an attempt to address that. It became very unpopular on the other side of things because it is quite restrictive. But you do have an issue there, wouldn't you agree, where you have a very real or an arguable case of a treaty, an important aspect of the treaty that has a bearing on regulation that has been decided in favour of quite a rigid upholding of the treaty, and then something on the other side where you can see something that is very clearly tough for business, and this bill would seem to direct the government to veer towards business and away from the treaty in a way that might lead to problems down the line, because you can see if you do have issues with water, that iwi might not be happy with it.
Well, I think, to be honest, it's not quite right to characterise iwi or Māori as having one interest in this. A lot of people in the Māori world, particularly post-settlement governance entities, are very big into economic development and business, and are very concerned about the regulatory impacts that they have. They want to be able to develop property, to farm, to use water, just as well as anyone else. And what we all have a common interest in, and what the Regulatory Standards Bill promotes, is the idea that we have property, the government should not interfere with it unless there's a very good public reason to do so, that it should consult those who are materially and directly affected, and that it should be able to define the problem and show that the benefits of the law are greater than the costs. Now, if we all just stuck to that, I think we would have much healthier, wealthier, longer lives in this country, and far less time tied up in red tape and regulation.
Do you have any regrets at all about sort of any of the language that you've used and the way that you communicated this, from the regulatory derangement syndrome to your newsletter that you just put out about a horde of left-wing academics and lobby groups? I mean, say what you want about defending the bill, absolutely is your prerogative, but is it, as a minister, is that the sort of language that you should be using during this debate?
Yeah, I actually stand by all of it for the very simple reason that I don't know how else you can describe people who just repeatedly say things that aren't true in a coordinated way. And I think that you have to call that out. I don't know how else you describe people say things that are repeatedly untrue, and then you hear that the untruths get repeated, and sometimes you realise a person that said that a lie can travel twice around the world while the truth is doing up his shoelaces was onto something. So yeah, I don't know how else you can describe that behaviour.
Mr. Seymour, do you think banks are being fairly taxed?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I look at what they're paying, and some of the biggest taxpayers in New Zealand are banks. They're all paying right on the 28% average tax rate as their company tax. There's nothing to suggest that they are not paying the same share that they would if they were any other kind of business.
So what do you make Nicola Willis beginning work and looking at whether the tax settings with regards to banks are appropriate?
Well, Nicola, like most ministers, is always asking for advice, always tossing around the ideas, but I suspect the outcome of that will be that they're fairly taxed.
So if she brought a proposal to Cabinet prior to the next budget, as she suggested she might do, would you block that if it was going to increase the tax that banks had to pay?
Well, the question would be around fairness, and I think the way to look at it is, sure, they're in banking, but if they were, say, a dairy company or a manufacturing company, and or a retail company, and they were doing pretty much the same stuff, making the same profit and paying the same tax, would you treat them differently? Because one of the core principles of taxation is that like taxpayers pay tax alike, and unlike taxpayers pay tax unalike based on the size of the difference. So you'd start with fairness as your principle, but hey, look, Maybe there's more information I'm not aware of. I'm just looking at the headline figures published, I think, in the Herald the other day, which seem to show a consistent pattern.
She says she's looking at the Australian regime, looking at the comparisons. Australia has a major banks levy, which was introduced in 2017, which levied banks with liabilities of more than $100 billion. She's noted that New Zealand doesn't have a similar levy. What would you think if she was to propose to you a similar?
Well, I've seen the argument for that, and it goes something like this: banks inevitably get bailed out if they're so big that their failure would affect the entire economy. Maybe they should be putting something aside for that rainy day if it happens one day. That's the argument. It's in a way a form of de facto deposit insurance. And you can make arguments like that. They're interesting, but I'd have to see the detail of them.
On another subject, the police review, there was a police review out today which found insufficient monitoring of police internet use and inconsistent enforcement of security policies. How concerned are you by that?
Well, you're always going to be concerned about any use of data or information by police. Now, these are people that want to keep a register of where every firearm in the country is kept. You wouldn't want them to ever be sloppy with their data because that could be very dangerous.
And Pharmac staff go on strike for the first time ever this week. Your response?
Well, look, they have pulled off a heroic effort getting the cash out the door to buy a huge amount of new medicines for New Zealanders in recent months. They've also come under a lot of pressure. We're investing in new IT systems for Pharmac, and we'll do our best to pay competitively. There's a culture review underway, and we have a new chief executive starting soon, who I just met last week. So there's a lot going on at Pharmac, and I hope that we can work through any industrial issues as part of that.
Just back on that police question, do you think police officers are being monitored enough for their internet use?
Well, I'm not in a position to comment because I haven't evaluated the monitoring regime, but clearly from today's report, there's some room for improvement.
Minister, just one last question on the treaty and the regulations bill. Your treaty principles bill recognises the rights of the union. Why does your regulation bill not need to do this?
Well, I guess because it wouldn't add anything to the process of evaluating new laws. If it was going to, and again, the option's still there, by the way. Anyone who actually has an example of how this would change the outcome, well, it's a serious question. Anyone that can provide an example of how this would change the outcome and actually get us better laws, well, we're open to listening. But so far, I hear people who say it should be in there almost for ornamental purposes. I think that's an insult to the Regulatory Standards Bill and the treaty.
So in that case, the rights of the hapū as attributed that come from the Treaty of Waitangi are inherently recognised, even though it doesn't say it, because they have rights, I assume, I think, in the treaty. They're sort of inherently recognised in the bill, even though the treaty.
Well, you have the right to be consulted, you have the right to liberty, you have the right to property. Everyone has those same rights. They already exist in various parts of New Zealand's law and lawmaking process. We're pulling that together. And of course, that's going to give strong protection to Māori and everyone else, as it should.
National Web New Zealand First have at various points suggested they might want to see some changes to the bill. Have you had any more detailed discussions with them? Have they articulated what changes they might want, and how amenable would you be to that?
No, well, the government's position is it's based on a coalition agreement which says pass the bill. If they have, as I say, I'm always open to hearing what sort of constructive suggestions they have, but at this point, I'm not hearing any specific suggestions.
Is the ACT Party standing a candidate in Tāmaki Makaurau?
No.
Why is that?
We don't stand in the Māori wards. We don't believe that New Zealand should have different wards based on race. All right, folks. It's 45 minutes, so I reckon that's it up for all of us. You have a great day.
Thank you.